steam power. In Victorian Britain, there was no shortage of human labor. Poor peasants and vagrants moved to the cities in large numbers in search of jobs, waiting for work. As you will know, when there is plenty of labor, wages are low. So industrialists had no problem of labor shortage or high wage costs. They did not want to introduce machines that got rid of human labor and required large capital investment. In many industries, the demand for labor was seasonal. Gas workers and breweries were especially busy through the cold months. So they needed more workers to meet their peak demand. Bookbinders and printers, catering to Christmas demand too, needed extra hands before December. At the waterfront, winter was the time that ships were repaired and spruced up. In all such industries where production fluctuated with the season, industrialists usually preferred hand labor, employing workers for the season. A range of products could be produced only with hand labor. Machines were oriented to producing uniforms, standardized goods for a mass market. But the demand in the market was often for goods with intricate designs and specific shapes. In the mid-19th century Britain, for instance, 500 varieties of hammers were produced and 45 kinds of axes. These required human skill, not mechanical technology. In Victorian Britain, the upper classes, the aristocrats, and the bourgeois preferred things produced by hand. Handmade products came to symbolize refinement and class. They were better finished, individually produced, and carefully designed. Machine-made goods were for exports to the colonies. In countries with labor shortage, industrialists were keen on using mechanical power so that the need for human labor could be minimized. This was the case in 19th century America. Britain, however, had no problem hiring human hands. Before the age of machine industries, silk and cotton goods from India dominated the international market in textiles. Coarser cottons were produced in many countries, but the finer varieties often came from India. Armenian and Persian merchants took the goods from Punjab to Afghanistan, Eastern Persia, and Central Asia. Bales of fine textiles were carried on camelback via the northwest frontier, through mountain passes and across deserts. A vibrant sea trade operated through the main pre-colonial ports. Surat on the Gujarat coast connected India to the Gulf and Red Sea ports. Masulipatam on the Coromandel coast and Hooghly in Bengal had trade links with Southeast Asian ports. A variety of Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade, financing production, carrying goods and supplying exporters. Supply merchants linked the port towns to the inland regions. They gave advances to weavers, procured the woven cloth from weaving villages, and carried the supply to the ports. At the ports, the big shippers and export merchants had brokers who negotiated the price and bought goods from the supply merchants operating inland. By the 1750s, this network, controlled by Indian merchants, was breaking down. The European companies gradually gained power, first securing a variety of concessions from local courts, then the monopoly rights to trade. This resulted in a decline of the old ports of Surat and Hooghly, through which local merchants had operated. Exports from these ports fell dramatically. The credit that had financed the earlier trade began drying up, and the local bankers slowly went bankrupt. In the last years of the 17th century, the gross value of trade that passed through Surat had been rupees 16 million. By the 1740s, it had slumped to rupees 3 million. While Surat and Hooghly decayed, Bombay and Calcutta grew. This shift from the old ports to the new ones was an indicator of the growth of colonial power. Trade through the new ports came to be controlled by European companies and was carried in European ships. While many of the old trading houses collapsed, those that wanted to survive had to now operate within a network shaped by European trading companies. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to say that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. Yet, by the beginning of the 19th century, we see the beginning of a long decline of textile exports from India. In 1811-12, these goods accounted for 33% of India's exports. By 1850-51, it was no more than 3%. Why did this happen? What were its implications? As cotton industries developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries. They pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textiles so that Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition from outside. At the same time, industrialists persuaded the East India Company to sell British manufactures in Indian markets as well. Exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically in the early 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, there had been virtually no import of cotton piece goods into India. But by 1850, cotton piece goods constituted over 31% of the value of Indian imports, and by the 1870s, this figure was over 50%. Cotton weavers in India thus faced two problems at the same time. Their export market collapsed and the local market shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. Produced by machines at lower costs, the imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. By the 1850s, reports from most weaving regions in India narrated stories of decline and desolation. By the 1860s, weavers faced a new problem. They could not get sufficient supply of raw cotton of good quality. When the American Civil War broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off, Britain turned to India. As raw cotton exports from India increased, the price of raw cotton shot up. Weavers in India were starved of supplies and forced to buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices. In this situation, weaving could not pay. Then, by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods. How could weaving industries possibly survive? Factories come up. The first cotton mill in Bombay came up in 1854 and it went up into production 2 years later. By 1862, 4 mills were at work with 94,000 spindles and 2,150 looms. Around the same time, jute mills came up in Bengal, the first being set up in 1855 and another 7 years later in 1862. In North India, the Elgin mill was started in Kanpur in the 1860s. And a year later, the first cotton mill of Ahmedabad was set up. By 1874, the first spinning and weaving mill of Madras began production. Who set up the industries? Where did the capital come from? Who came to work in the mills?